Okay, so we talked about Darwin, talked about what he saw on his voyage around the world as ship's naturalist on Her Majesty's ship Beagle. Um, they did, because we have a student from Namibia here. I don't know if they stopped on what's now Namibian territory. They did stop at the Cape Colony, so they got fairly close to where you're from. I don't know if they got all the way up to I probably can't pronounce it right, Windhoek, or wherever. They did stop off in Brazil a lot. We have a couple of Brazilian students, might notice that. And they get back to England in 1836. Our young hero lives in London for a while, gets married, starts suffering attacks of a chronic illness. We don't know what it is, but he was half invalid for most of his adult life, had these bouts of severe weakness. It may have been a tropical disease he picked up in South America. It may have been something he was born with. Today, we'll probably never really know. But he ended up buying a house that was in a small village at the time. It's now in London because London has grown so much. This is it. It's a museum now. It's called Down House, and he lived here until his death in 1882. When he got back, he was quite busy. He'd been collecting and shipping uh, uh, stuffed animals and preserved plants and fossils and rocks and things. He had work editing the official reports of the Beagle voyage, but he did find time to think about a very strange possibility. Maybe, just maybe, biological species weren't fixed. There was something that could cause them to change over many generations. And if that were true, it would seem to explain a lot, because not only Darwin, but many other scientists had noticed some rather odd things about life. I've already talked about the fossil record and the increasing realization that life on Earth was old and it had been different in the past. But there were some other things. Darwin was a pioneer in studying what we now call biogeography. That's just the study of why we have various animals and plants living in the places where they do. And we've already seen this contemplating Galapagos finches. Here you've got 4 of the Galapagos finches, 4 of the 14 species that we've got. They're all finches. They've got structures, the structure is basically very close to what you'd find in South American finches, but it's still unique to the Galapagos. You have 14 very similar finch species on these islands, all in a small area, and yet they've all got these adaptations that fit them for particular styles of life. Like bird number 1, the large-beaked ground finch crunches up big seeds. Bird number 4, the cactus finch, has this very narrow beak that's very good for eating fruits and seeds off of spiny cactus. You could compare these to linesman's pliers versus needle nose pliers, each of which is useful for a different task. Why is this the case? Why do you have 14 different kinds of finch in the Galapagos, some of them with parrot-like beaks, but you don't have any parrots? Or narrow probing beaks like flickers, but no flickers? And then there's something called comparative anatomy, which Darwin was not the first to notice, be it said. This has been noted ever since the 1500s. There's the bones of a bat wing on the left, a seal flipper on the right, your hand in the center. They do very different things. Bats fly, seals swim, humans play piano, and make tools and all of the things that we do. They do very different things, and yet we could match these with each other bone for bone. Same number of fingers, same number of joints per finger, same number of wrist bones. We could do the same thing with a dog's paw or a cat's paw, allowing for the fact that some bones seem to be missing. We could do the same thing with a pig trotter or even a cow hoof. Why should structures that are that different in what they do be built using identical arrangements of bones? Think that over for a bit. Other scientists at the time, in particular a gent by the name of Carl von Baer, had pointed out that even if adults might look completely different, sometimes embryos were virtually identical. Grown-up turtles and chickens you can easily tell apart. But if you were to crack open a fertilized egg at the right stage, you would find that their embryos are almost impossible to tell apart. You can hardly tell one from the other. There was a time when you looked not exactly identical, but pretty similar to those top embryos of the turtle and the chicken. You didn't look grossly different from that. And it's only later in your development from fertilized egg to adult that species start taking on distinctive features. So it's only later that that turtle gets a shell and the chicken's limbs develop into wings and so on. There were even cases where embryos of some species have features that look like adults of others. Turtles, chickens, and you all had at one stage clefts, narrow divisions up in the neck region. Those clefts look like the structures that would develop into gill slits in a fish. In you, they pretty much disappear. You no longer have gills in your neck unless you're Aquaman or something. And I don't think Jason Momoa is registered for this course. But why have them in the first place? What were they doing there? Why should you have features that look like they would develop into gills in a fish embryo, but then not actually develop any gills? Who knows? And then what about fossils? Why should fossils change over time? What's making them do that? What is making life change? Darwin had already noticed that there were fossils that blended the features of what we'd now call very separate groups. This particular one wasn't discovered until a few years after Darwin had published his big book on the subject. It's from a quarry in Germany called Solnhofen. It's called Archaeopteryx lithographica. It looks like a small dinosaur, which at the time were considered to be basically big lizards. It's got claws on its hands. It's got a long tail. You can't really see it in this picture, but it's got teeth in its mouth. And we would consider this a small running little dino, except for the fact that it's well enough preserved that we can see impressions of the feathers that it used to have. So is this thing dinosaur or bird? What do we do with that? Did someone say something? I heard a voice for just a minute. And then what about this? If you've ever seen a dog or a cat or a horse, you know that mammals can move their external ears. Your dog can prick up his ears when he's interested. My cats lay their ears back when they're about to try to eat my hand. You've seen cows and horses flicking their ears to get rid of flies. You have the same muscles in the same place. They're right here. They're called your auricularis muscles. and they're capable of wiggling your ears. The thing is that most people never learn how to use these muscles. Um, Maybe a few of you are capable of wiggling your ears. In a class this size, there's usually at least one, but most people never do. And I've yet to find anybody where ear wiggling made a difference to their survival or reproduction. I've yet to find anybody who was able to save his or her life by a talent for ear wiggling. I mean, I'm not saying such a person couldn't exist, but I've never heard of it. I've yet to find anybody whose ability to have offspring depended on his or her ability to wiggle his or her ears. So if you can't use them for anything, if most people never use them for anything at all, why do you have them? What are the muscles doing there? Huh. So he put all of this together, and by 1844, he's got his grand idea, collecting every sort of fact which could bear any way on what our species, as he says, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, I am almost convinced that species are not immutable. Species are not unchanging. This is kind of big. As he puts it, it is like confessing a murder. The simplest way to explain everything was the idea that life on Earth had changed over time, and the change was what we now call genetic. Living things look like each other because they're descended from common ancestors. The reason you have 14 species of finch in the Galapagos Islands is that they're all descended from one ancestral species of finch, which we don't know exactly. It might have been blown there by a storm or something like that, whatever it was. That finch got there and then gave rise to descendants. And the descendants look like each other because they're descended from a common ancestor, but they're different from each other because the descendant species have changed over many generations. We're not talking about change within a lifetime. The changes that you go through from, newborn baby to screaming toddler to surly teenager to fine upstanding citizen is not what we're talking about. We're talking about change from one generation to the next over many, many generations. The reason why organisms as different as a chicken and a turtle have identical embryos is because they inherited that pattern of developing from a common ancestor. The reason why you've got ear wiggling muscles that you almost certainly can't use is because you inherited the pattern of developing muscles attached to your ears from a very distant ancestor that wasn't human, and you've still got it even though you can't do anything with it. Kind of like an ugly antique that you can't get rid of because it used to belong to your great grandma or something like that. A lot of this, like I've said, wasn't that new. Uh, People looking at the fossil record had already concluded that life on Earth had changed over time. Many of the discoveries that I pointed out, Darwin didn't actually make. So what did he do? First of all, he made the strongest case that anyone had ever made, gathering more evidence than anyone had done before, that biological change over time had happened. That's what evolution is, by the way. It just means change over time. The other thing he does is propose a mechanism for how it happens, what causes that change. And it's a mechanism we can observe today, that we repeatedly have observed today. It's not necessarily the only thing that causes evolutionary change, but it's thought to be the prime mover. not the only cause of change, but by far the most important cause of change. And that's Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. He'd been reading a book by a scholar named Thomas Malthus. Malthus had been studying human populations, and he'd argued that anytime you had a human population, a group of people living in a country, that population would always outgrow its own food supply given enough time. You can increase your food supply if you cultivate more land, develop better crops and tools, put more people to work, things like that. But Malthus argued that ultimately that population would outstrip its resource base, and then there wouldn't be enough for everyone, and you'd get poverty. And tried to work out some solutions for how you could avoid this happening. Darwin later wrote that the same thing was true of any species, not just human, but anything from bacteria to fruit flies to elephants, that any population is capable of outgrowing the resources it has available to it. Even plants don't use food as we think of it, but there's only so much nutrients in the soil, only so much water, only so much solar energy per cubic meter for plants to use. And a plant population, like an animal population, could grow so much that the area starts running out of nutrients or water or even sunlight. So as Darwin later wrote, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be, dun, 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 the formation of a new species. Here's how it works. Populations of living organisms are capable of increasing exponentially. Exponential growth means that they'll double in a fixed time interval. So if you start with 2 bunny rabbits, in a certain period of time, you'll have 4, and then you'll have 8. And then after another period of time, you have 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, without limit. They're capable of doing that, but in nature, we don't see this. Populations usually stay roughly constant. They might spike, they might drop. Sometimes, as in like a plague of locusts, they might explode and then crash. But most of the time, populations stay fairly close to a constant level unless some catastrophe happens that knocks them down. They stay close to what we call carrying capacity, which we'll get to at the end of this course. All right, I heard something over the audio, pausing to see if anybody's got a question. Okay, we seem to be good. The result is that not all of the offspring produced by members of a population can survive. Not every offspring makes it to adulthood and leaves offspring of its own in any species. They can't. That means that any population is experiencing what Malthus wrote about. Any population can ultimately grow beyond what its resources can support. And that sets up what Darwin called a struggle for existence. That's not necessarily a violent struggle. When I say struggle for existence, people tend to think of whatever's on Shark Week. A great white shark savagely tearing apart helpless baby seals, or savage lions savagely tearing apart helpless gazelles, or whatever it is on Animal Planet this week. It doesn't necessarily have to be violent at all. I mean, trees in a forest are trying to soak up sunlight and there's only so much available to go around, and the trees in the forest are not punching each other. I mean, unless they're ants or something like that. Trees in the forest are not trying to kill each other, but it is true there's not enough sunlight for every tree to get everything it needs to produce lots of seedlings. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, there's a song by the rock group Rush called The Trees that talks about a battle between different tree species. Um, Highly recommend it if you like progressive rock. Anyway, so that sets up this struggle for existence. And here's what I mean. Here's a couple of fruit flies caught in the act of trying to make more fruit flies. We'll be hearing a lot about fruit flies in upcoming lectures because we've learned a lot about genetics from them. But you may have had these in your kitchen if you've ever accidentally let a couple of bananas on the counter get a little bit too ripe, or not taken the compost out in fast enough time. You have a way of getting these. And their life cycle takes about 7 days under ideal conditions. 7 days from eggs being laid to adult fruit flies that can breed and make more fruit flies. If you started with a single pair of flies and you gave them perfect conditions, all the food that they needed, just the right temperature and humidity and water, everything that they needed, and you let them breed, the next generation you would have several hundred fruit flies. And if you let them breed and gave them all perfect conditions and kept on going, and allowed every fruit fly that was ever born or hatched to survive and have babies of its own, in a year you would have a ball of flies the size of the Earth. And the Earth would be completely replaced by solid flies. Now, the fact that this has not happened, the fact that the Earth is not a ball of solid flies, shows you that something has to be acting to keep fruit fly populations down. Not every fruit fly that hatches from its pupa goes on to have lots and lots of babies and then finally dies of a ripe old age, surrounded by generations of its kin. Many fruit flies, in fact, the majority of them, die before that can happen. Something has to act to keep those populations down. It could be insufficient food. It could be insufficient water. It could be predators like spiders. It could be disease. Fruit flies actually can get various diseases. I've seen one. It could be starvation. It could be angry homeowners with raid. It could be a lot of things, but something will happen to keep fruit fly populations from growing exponentially indefinitely. It has to. Okay, seemingly unrelated, here's part 2. Organisms in a population vary. They're different from each other. And at least some of that variation is heritable, meaning that offspring tend to show features that their parents also had. The student population of UCA varies. We all look different. Everybody in this class is different from each other in height, weight, eye color, skin color, hair texture, and in more subtle things like features of our metabolism, risk of getting certain diseases, things like that. We're all different. And it's also true that you look like your biological parents. And if you have kids, the kids will resemble you. We pass on features to our offspring and we inherit them somehow from our parents. Nobody in Darwin's time understood how this happens. And it is a very big black box And we're going to take about the middle third of the course to work out how it happens. But it does, in fact, happen, and people have observed this for thousands of years. I mean, especially animal and plant breeders. If you've ever had dogs or cats that had puppies, you've noticed that the puppies tend to look like their parents. You can see it in your own family. Um, it's true of these are little surf clams from the Gulf Coast of Florida called coquina clams, Donax variabilis. And you can see that they're all different in color and in pattern. When I was little, the family used to go on vacations at a place called Fort Walton Beach, Florida. And I used to collect these all the time. You could dig them up by the handful from some of those beaches. And I've seen this ever since I was about 8, that members of the surf clam population of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, outside the Island Surf condo, which is where we always stayed, I highly recommend it, members of this population are different. And if we worked out a way to breed surf clams in a tank, we would see that variation gets inherited. Offspring would tend to look like their parents, not exactly like them, but they'd still share features in common. Okay, here's the third thing. Some individuals vary in ways that increase the odds that they will survive and reproduce. Others vary in ways that decrease their chances. Let's say we have a population of bunny rabbits in a forest, and then all of a sudden the big bad wolf comes in and starts eating bunny rabbits. Okay, some bunnies will be just a little faster than others, and they have maybe not a guarantee, but a better chance of getting away from the wolf. Some bunnies are going to blend in with the background just a little bit better, and they've got a better chance that the wolf isn't going to see them. Some bunnies might have better hearing than others and be able to hide before the wolf gets close enough to see them. Some bunnies might be big enough and strong enough that they can beat up the wolf, for all I know. They'll vary in ways that increase the chances that they'll survive and get to have bunnies of their own. Others will vary in ways that decrease their chances. Some bunnies are going to be very slow. Some bunnies will have fur that's very obvious in the forest. Some bunnies are just really stupid. Some of those rabbits will vary in ways that decrease the odds that they'll have babies. Okay. Add that to the fact that individuals pass on their traits. So individuals that vary in ways that increase their odds of reproducing will produce more offspring like themselves. The slow bunnies are likely to get eaten. The fast bunnies are likely to survive, and they will have fast offspring. The well-camouflaged bunnies are likely to survive, and they will produce well-camouflaged offspring, while the brilliantly colored, stick out like a sore thumb bunnies will probably get eaten before they can reproduce. End result is a species will change over time. Multiply that by a cajillion years, and Darwin reckoned you could explain all of these changes that we see in the life that appears on Earth. Darwin was inspired by a practice called artificial selection, and he ended up doing experiments himself that he could do at home. He couldn't travel. Remember, he had this chronic illness. We don't know what it was, but he was able to do some experiments at his house raising pigeons. You may not be aware of this. Pigeon breeding doesn't seem to be that common a hobby, but there are people that do it. I've met some people that do this today. And there are literally hundreds of fancy pigeons that people keep and care for and breed and show at pigeon shows, just like there are dog shows and, just like there are livestock shows. If you've ever gone to the Faulkner County Fair, you really should sometime. It's pretty fun. Lots of fried things to eat on sticks. But if you go into the livestock barn, you can see people showing their prize chickens or prize rabbits or pigs or cows, what have you, and getting prizes for the best ones. Well, you can do the same thing with pigeons. And these are some of the fancy pigeons that Darwin knew in this illustration, and some of them look pretty damn weird. And yet we know, and we've got historical records of this, that all of those weird looking pigeons, all of those came from this bird. This is the wild rock pigeon. This is the pigeon that you see around here. It's actually native to Europe and Asia. It was brought here originally for food, and flocks of pigeons have now kind of gone wild. Around Conway, I usually see them down by the railroad tracks. These are the pigeons that hang out in parks and beat up little old ladies and take their breadcrumbs. This is what the ancestor of all of those fancy pigeons looks like. And starting with this, over the past few thousand years, breeders have created things like that. That's a black fantail. And that's just weird. And what they've done is, in every flock of pigeons, they'll select individuals that have traits that they like. They'll let those individuals breed. Individuals that don't have those traits end up on the barbecue grill or in the soup or whatever it is that you do with pigeons that you don't want to keep. So some breeder, hundreds of years ago maybe, had a flock of pigeons and saw some that had bigger and fancier tails than others and thought, hey, that tail is pretty cute. So the pigeons with the big tails were allowed to breed and have more big-tailed pigeons like themselves. Pigeons that did not have magnificent tails ended up on the grill. Repeat that over many generations, and you get fantail pigeons with these great big fans of feathers for a tail. Oh, and also sticking out their breasts so far that you can hardly see the fact they've got a head. And some of these get really weird. There's a Scandaroon pigeon on the left. That's actually one that Darwin personally kept and stuffed after it was dead, with this weird hooked beak and very slender build. On the left, a Bukhara trumpeter, which has so many poofy feathers on the sides of his head that you can't even see the head. It's also got big fans of feathers on its feet. If you saw these two birds and I told you they were wild, you'd probably call them separate species. They don't really look like each other except for the fact that they're both birds. And yet, we know that they're descended from the wild rock pigeon. You can observe this today. Darwin talked to a famous pigeon breeder who said that he could produce any beak shape you wanted in 5 years. You give him a beak shape and he'll pick out the birds from his flock that are closest to that shape, let them breed, get rid of the rest, repeat that over many generations, and you can produce anything from the tiny beak of a short-faced tumbler pigeon on the upper right to the great big hooked beak of the Bagadotan carrier pigeon down at the bottom. Up there at the top left is what a wild pigeon looks like, and you can see how the beak has been made to change quite a bit. You can even modify behavior and intelligence. On the left, the homing pigeon, those are used for racing. You can take your homing pigeon, drive hundreds of miles away, let it go, and it's such a good navigator, it will find its way back home. They have navigated their way home from as far away as 1,100 miles, flying at an average of 50 miles an hour. These are the pigeons that used to be used to carry messages back in like World War I and the American Civil War, before radio and telephone was practical. In the middle, the English short-faced tumbler doesn't fly that fast, but it turns backflips in midair. At the right, that's a parlor roller pigeon, which cannot fly, but if you put it on the ground, it will start turning somersaults, flapping its wings. I've seen people racing parlor roller pigeons. It looks like they're playing lawn bowling with birds. The silliest thing I've ever seen. So even behavior patterns can be modified. So can intelligence. Homing pigeons are very smart birds, but my friend who breeds Bokhara trumpeters, the ones on the left here, told me that they are colossally stupid. They're basically cucumbers covered in feathers. So even that can be modified. Bokharas have not been bred for their brains. And the selection process can make varieties become almost indefinitely different from each other. On the left, that's your wild rock pigeon, Columbia levia. On the right, that's a species from Southeast Asia called the pink-necked fruit dove, Telenopus porphyrius. They are wild species from different parts of the world, but they're about the same size. They've got pretty much the same shaped beak. They've got similar habits. They've even got similar color over most of their body, except for the head and neck. They're clearly both, pigeons, even though we call these separate species. But which are more different from each other? Rock pigeons and fruit doves, or Brunner powders and Ackerman tumblers? The birds you're looking at here were produced by artificial selection, and they're more different from each other in every way you could name than these wild species. And if human artificial selection can do all of this in just a couple of decades, what could natural selection do over millions of years? Here's a quick case study for you. 1981, a couple in Southern California adopted a stray cat. Nothing strange about that. I seem to do it all the time. But this particular stray cat had a feature that nobody had ever seen before. This is she. Her name was Shulamith, and she had curly ears. Oh, this is where you all go, oh. Okay. Well, she had curly ears, but she was otherwise quite healthy. And the Rugas thought that these curly ears would be really, really cute. So they bred her to 3 different toms. The tomcats had straight ears, but some of the kittens had curly ears. Well, they saved the curly-eared cats and bred them. The cats that didn't have such curly ears were spayed or neutered and kept as pets. They're perfectly nice cats. They just didn't let them breed. So the Rugas and later breeders picked out the curliest eared offspring, bred them, repeated that over many generations, and we now have a new breed of cat called the American Curl. And the breed continues to be developed as breeders select the cats with the best curls, breed those. Cats whose curls are not up to snuff are perfectly nice cats, but they're generally spayed or neutered and kept as pets. You can do it with plants as well. This is a bad tasting weed from Northern Europe. Tastes nasty and grows in bad soil. Somebody must have really been desperate to start eating this thing, but people did. and gardeners started growing it, and they saved the seeds of the plants that they liked the most. Plants that had desirable traits were allowed to provide seeds for the next generation. Plants that did not have desirable traits ended up in the soup. The end result is broccoli at the upper left, cauliflower, kohlrabi at the lower right. You may not know kohlrabi. It's got big, thick lower stems that are quite tasty. Brussels sprouts at the lower right. Cultivated cabbage and kale and collards. All of these descend from wild cabbage, which doesn't really look like any of them. And that's possible because for thousands of years, farmers in different parts of the world have kept seeds from their biggest and tastiest plants that had features that they wanted. Plants that didn't have those features end up in the crock pot or pulled up and thrown on the compost or whatever it is. The result of this over just a few hundred years is new varieties. One last one. I know we're almost out of time, but this is a wild grass native to central Mexico called teosinte. You'd have to be desperate to eat this because the seeds are small. There's only a few on each plant, and the seeds are encased in a coat that you have to crack and remove. You can't just swallow the seeds whole. You have to get through that seed coat. And about 10,000 years ago, people started planting seeds from the plants that had the biggest, the most digestible seeds. Plants that don't have these traits end up getting pulled out or eaten. Plants that do have these traits, those seeds get saved for the next generation. And after 10,000 years of this, we have gone from teosinte to corn. No longer has that seed coat. You no longer have to crack off the seed coats before you eat your corn on the cob. You can see it's a lot bigger, lots more kernels, tastes a lot better. And it's not just corn, it's over 300 varieties of corn, some of which you would eat fresh off the cob, some of which are ground into cornmeal, some of which you can pop, some of which are grown these days mostly to be pretty, like the colorful corn that you get around Thanksgiving, for decoration. There's varieties of corn that are used mostly for animal feed, and so on. All of that is artificial selection over just a few decades, centuries, maybe a few thousand years. Take that potential and let it operate over millions of years, and who knows what it can do. All right, by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas. Let me see here. I will now stop the recording, and we're done.